It started out with an idea to make a documentary.
Now, with over 60 interviews completed and more to record, it's time to listen fully.
These are the stories from those who experienced the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program.
Hello and welcome to episode 4. My name is Lindsay Cowdell-LaPointe.
And I am Dawn McKechnie.
This episode, we have a special person to both Dawn and myself. Nan Moore was one of our youth advisors and continues to this day to be an important person in our lives.
Nan represents one of those safe adults that we could always turn to as youth with an open ear and a loving heart.
Nan wrote us a testimonial at the beginning of this project, but we never had a chance to interview her until recently. One of my favorite lines from the testimonial was, quote, "My life has become more conscious because of the years I spent in YRUU as an advisor, chaplain, DRE, advocate, and friend. I say to all those YRUUers out there, thank you, thank you, thank you. YRUU is where I learned about me." Unquote. Now, here's Nan.
My name is Nan Moore. My history with YRUU is I was a youth advisor and very involved in YRUU for a good 10 years. I ended up after I left becoming a director, I became a hospice chaplain. I took CPE, Clinical Pastoral Ed at Brigham and Women's. And then I went on to become a hospice chaplain, doing hospice care and pediatric palliative care. And then I ended up later on becoming a spiritual director, Unitarian Universalist. So it's been a full circle. So I was raised Lutheran. My family culture was German, with a lot of German culture that was sort of, there was just a lot of German culture in my family, food, holidays, even the faith tradition of being Lutheran. I was confirmed when I was in the 9th grade. And then my family stopped going to church. And so, because I was the youngest, and as I moved into getting into the Unitarian Universalist circles, I was looking for a church for my kids. They were 4 and 5. Adam and Matt were 4 and 5 years old. So I had a business, I had a hairdressing business, and this woman told me about Unitarian Universalism, and there was a church in Brewster, which was like a half hour from where I lived. And so I went to it, and when I went there, I just cried. And I found that after I left church, every time I went to church, I would cry. And so I knew that was the right place for me. And so I started out teaching RE classes when my sons were younger. And as they got into middle school, they didn't want to go anymore. And so they would only go if I was going to teach. So that was kind of a big deal. And so what I did is I wrote a curriculum called Prayers and Affirmations from Different Faiths, because I wanted to do something that was experiential. And so Jim Robinson, who's probably one of my most important spiritual teacher, was the minister in Brewster at that time. And so he and I sat down and we wrote down all these prayers and affirmations, and I wrote activities each lesson that would kind of go with it. And so at the end of the year, we presented a play. And so he was somebody who believed in me because I had these learning disabilities and wasn't real confident. And so, and at that time, computers were just starting to come out. So I had found a computer that was at the church fair. It had like, the old computer papers that were like super long, like, it was like a continuous paper. It wasn't like separate papers and stuff. And that's how I started to write. And so I ended up, we went there for probably about 7 years. And then this job came up in Barnstable. And so I applied and I got the position. And so I became the director there in 1996. It was interesting because I felt in my own life like if I had a youth group, um, things could have been different for me, like with learning disabilities and having like a lot of challenges. And um that's where my devotion came from, was coming from that place. Like, wow, like I can create something for people like me. And so the first year that I was there, the youth group had done a con before. Never done one, so hosted one, which was like a great experience. Um, and I can remember that's when I met Jason that year, who we're still friends today, Jason Lyden. And yeah, so that was a pretty interesting experience. And then Matt was in the youth group at that time too.
So that
Um,
conference, I believe, if I'm correct, was it a sleepover conference hosted at your church? Was it the one that we talked about astrological
it
signs?
was.
Yeah. So my memory of that is you led a meditation workshop. And I
Mhm.
don't know if you remember leading a meditation workshop, but
Mhm.
um, but my question for you is, so you're seeing these gathering of youth for the first time. For you, you were thinking about your own self and you were hoping that you had this for your life. How do you separate your adult brain with your memories of your youth and then supporting what's in front of you? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, so for me, it was the driver. There was kind of like there was that was the purpose. The purpose was to, wow, I could create something for young people that I didn't have. Not with any plan but knowing how important it was, especially if you were kind of on the outskirts or, if you had some differences that other people didn't have. And for me, it was like the learning disabilities and not being sort of in that whole academic vibe of everything. So, yeah, and then and it was really interesting. I once I got into, Blue Channing District and was the director there, I was so devoted, like to create this. I remember the first SDC was probably in 2000, no, 1997 maybe. And so there were different youth from all the different districts who had to apply. So Matt had gotten the position to he went to Texas. Matt Moore is my son. And so he had gotten that position and he had to apply for it. And that actually started to change so much in his life. Like all of a sudden, he was connected with people all over the US. And he was young at the time. He was like in ninth grade. So at least they knew that he could be, they would have him for like a couple of years instead of having somebody that was older. And that was kind of new. That was like the first SDC, Spiritual Development Conference. Um, and so, yeah. And so I remember I've got the date here, of the GAs and stuff. We went to, I don't know if you might have gone on this when we went to Rochester.
Yes, I was there.
So
Didn't we take a big bus with a lot
I
of
rented a
different,
bus.
yeah.
I rented a bus so that it would be cheaper for everybody. Well, before, actually, the year before that, Matt and Aaron and I went to Arizona and we experienced like the first youth worship experience, and it was unbelievable. We went back to the room, we were singing the songs, we were trying to remember everything because it was so moving. It was so moving for them. It was moving for me. It was such a different, it was an experiential experience. And so that was, yeah, that was amazing. So the three of us had gone, and that was right before, yeah, that was before Rochester, the year before. So then I thought, well, if I rented a bus and then if everybody, it would be cheaper for everybody for transportation and it would be fun. And so yeah, so I did that and organized all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And and I should say that, I was a youth while you were an advisor. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where our connection is.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of the Duxbury congregation, and so that was close enough, and was in the same district as the Cape, and
Mm-hmm.
so we could do things like that. We could organize together and help each other with resources, and it was a wonderful time to connect with people beyond my own high school, which was
Mm-hmm.
so needed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
needed. Uh,
Well, the con culture.
yeah, tell me more, talk more about it. Yeah.
So the con culture, it was a big thing around being safe, like, and at that time people smoked, like you could smoke outside. So we didn't have to deal with cell phones, but there was always a lot around smoking. And later on, when I got into sort of doing some of the commitment to community stuff, what came up was that the whole idea that people commune around their addictions. So people that smoked, they became a kind of a tribe in a sense. And so that was interesting. That was a big thing back then. And then also I was on the youth board too for the district. And then Sun Tzu and myself, Sun Tzu was the director of Duxbury. The two of us were really committed to conferences. And what happened to me was it was that first conference. I'm gonna cry. Um, it was the first one when we were in Barnstable, and it was during the coffee house. And someone got up and talked about being suicidal. And they were very young, like 14 years old. And what ended up happening was everybody went up to them and just surrounded him like a puddle. And that was kind of a moment where I just went, oh my gosh, like the caring and the kindness and the loving energy that was all around that and the impact that it had on all of us that were there. Um, and we had to work out schedules with sleeping and movies and stuff like that, but that was really super impactful. Um, to know that, wow, this is something, to be in a place where there's no distractions. You only had to be in community. There was a lot of creativity because the home group would create activities. Um, Everybody would be together, you know, cooking together, serving meals. It was just, it was an amazing experience. And so after that, I, what touched me was how hard it was for young people who were queer coming out in high school. So I did a conference, Gay Youth Coming Out in High School. I had this guy, Scott Fitzmaurice, he had like a gay straight youth alliance. He purchased a house in downtown in Hyannis and gave like a supportive youth group basically for people that were, gay, queer, questioning. And so he came and spoke, and then all the youth group from our youth group went, and other youth from other youth groups came, and then we had adults there and everything. So it was really something. And then yeah, and then later on I had two youth that I knew personally who were suicidal. One had attempted suicide and the other one had ideations. And that really kind of hit me. One was a child of a friend, and the other was somebody in the youth group. And I couldn't not do anything about it. Like, it was something that just called to me, like, this is a real problem. And also at that time, the statistics on Cape Cod was like the fifth, like the fourth or fifth community in the United States with the highest suicide rate. And it was determined by census, like how many people lived in that, and they were all like 20-year-olds. And so I did one conference called it was When the People Come Together. And I organized that with a group of people, somebody from the church, and there was like a youth minister for Cape Cod, who also had ideations herself, suicidal ideations. So we went a whole year and laid this out. So I organized people, somebody from the Gay Straight Youth Alliance, people from schools, a homeopathy guy or a naturopath, a guidance counselor, and there were a lot of people that came. There was like 100 people that came, but it wasn't so heavy in the youth community. It was more adults. And so then it was so significant, but it wasn't youth led. And so what we did was we got a grant, to pay for food, to pay for whatever, and ended up having people, you were there, Lindsay, getting into groups. And then we had a youth leader and one of these adults in different groups to have conversations. And I'll never forget, I don't know, maybe you were in my group, but I can remember this young person said that when her grandmother died, she was so depressed. And her parents didn't want her to be depressed anymore. So they took her to a therapist and started giving her antidepressants. And that really hit me, like, wow, like there could have been something, there could have been another choice, you know what I mean, for her. Like there could have been, talk therapy or whatever. And then she ended up really getting into antidepressants. And, so that was like the late 90s. And then when we go to Massive Con in 2000, I had been in a 12-step program since 95, maybe 96, 95. And so now it's 2000. So I had been in for like 5 years. And that was one of the questions. Like there were so many youth that had drugs, prescription drugs. And I can remember there was a nurse there. So we decided, because there were so many people that were on drugs, that we should take all those drugs and have them somewhere so that the youth could get them, have access to them, but they would go to the nurse to get them, right? There was a garbage bag full of drugs. That freaking blew me away. I was like, oh my God. And there were some youth that were over medicated at that conference too. So
Can you tell me more about what Massive Con was, how it came about, and yeah.
Yeah, there were people were starting to get to know each other like in Mass Bay in different districts, and they wanted to get together and have a bigger conference, like outside of just their, like we were Blue Channing and Mass Bay. There might have been another district, I don't know. I want to say maybe Portland, Maine, like that. I don't know. I can't really remember, but it was an invitation that the Northeast, whoever these groups were, they were going to get together and have a conference. And so, and that was a big deal. That was a lot of people. It was a lot to manage as far as advisors and yeah.
What I remember being always surprised about was the sleeping arrangements
Mm.
for when we went, and we were in a camp. I think it was specifically meant for like Boy Scout camp.
It was in Groton.
Yeah, and they were bunk beds, but it was a lot of people could fit in one thing, but we could just pick like who we wanted to be with, regardless of gender or
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So tell me about what conversations there were around that, and if you remember, and why you all didn't feel the need to like separate the genders. I just am so curious about it.
I think it was like, I can't really remember. I want to say I thought that people had choices. Like you could go in same sex areas or you could go in different sex areas. You know what I mean? It didn't matter because there were people that were queer too. So, but you could have that choice. That's all I really remember. And I remember all of us being up all night and just checking on everybody and there weren't many of us, you know. Aileen was there then. Aileen was an advisor. Um, yeah, yeah.
And and so youth are really easily can stay up all night. Adults, it's a little bit harder. So I always think about
Mhm. Mm.
how you all got the strength to do that. How what was your recovery after these massive, no pun intended, gatherings? Because I know for youth it was a big up and a crash, right? And
Mm.
so what was it like for adults?
Well, with us, we did rounds. So we had sleeping rounds. So there was always somebody that was up. So you were up with like another adult and you could hang out and talk or whatever. So that's how we ran it at our conference. And I think Duxbury did the same. We did the same. That there were just, people that were up and just checking on folks because there were some people that could stay up and watch movies all night. Um, yeah, so for me, a con was such a spiritual experience, like on so many levels. Like as a participant, the adults that you were with were like people that really wanted to be there. People were taking their time, they were committed. If there was somebody from Rockland, there was only one kid there and they brought an advisor with them. There were some things that were difficult. Like then when we were doing the power shuffles, it became within all the districts in the Unitarian Association, especially in Texas, they banned they banned power shuffles because of people were sharing about sexual assaults and things like that. So that was a whole thing. And so the youth were really conscious. I remember Beth Dana and I did an SDC and we were planning on doing that as one of the activities, right? And the youth leaders came up to us and went, "No, you cannot do that here. This is banned from our district. We cannot do this in our district." So there was a lot of conversation around it. And then the advisors from that community too, they had like somebody that was on like a national youth board or something that was in Texas And so, but the conversations around it and what we did end up doing was amazing. Like it wasn't power shuffle, but again, it was an opportunity. Okay, like what else can we do, to stretch people? Like, what is that? How do we do that? And I remember after that conference, I got really sick. I had really bad headaches, 'cause it was almost like the energy was so intense, and Beth and I had bonded since then, you know what I mean? We did other stuff in the future, and we had really different styles. She was really academic and I was more experiential. Um, so yeah, and so again, your question around the cons, you walk away, you walk away almost in another state of consciousness, you know, when it's safe. Like safety was a huge thing for us, you know, and our youth within you had a real strict director and I was too. And we were like, no, this really needs to be safe. It was super important. Um, and so to see the beauty of people to come into a space, and I kind of go back to that very first conference, nobody knew each other. And by the time they left, and then when we did this astrology con, they had commonalities because they were in different astrological signs, earth, air, water, and fire. And then we did the skits and stuff. But it was so good. Yeah, it was so meaningful. Like, and I think that that's why, like, Sun Tzu and I especially constantly continued to do them because people knew, we had good youth that would listen to us too. Like, we need to be safe here but we want to have fun. And yeah, so it was like you go in sort of as someone who helped organize them, kind of like stressed out, right? But then as you were there, you were part of the community too. You know, you had your adult role, but you still had great conversations. You still connected with people, and each other. And we had fun as advisors too. Aileen and I used to just laugh till we would wet our pants almost, So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that that you and Sensu were the really safe adults. And I even think about traveling to General Assembly, and I remember Sun Tzu saying, "No, you're staying in the hotel across the street. You're not staying with the other youth in the youth housing." And we were like, "All right, okay." Yeah, we were totally
Yeah.
fine with it. But looking back at it, we're like, "Oh, that was probably a smart idea to keep us safe." I mean, I don't. I mean, I've heard stories of what
Mhm.
can happen with youth all living in a hotel room together. So
Mhm.
just looking back at that, my group always were grateful for that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yeah, I don't know. I don't have a question in there, but
It's like a reflection of like you understood, even though maybe you wanted to be with everybody, but everybody had a chance to be with everybody, but there needed to be like a safe space. It was the same in Rochester too. Yeah, Rochester was like that. I kept all my group in one place, Um, and then we get to 2001 and I was encouraged by Jason, like you should apply for the chaplain for General Assembly. He was the hooper at the time. And so I did that and I got the position. And there was very few youth staff. Jen Devine was the director at the time. Abby Tennis was one of the youth program specialists. Um, and so I was the chaplain. So I never slept, really hardly at all. I had a roommate there was a roommate. It seems like there was some other person that was maybe on staff that I didn't know. It wasn't somebody that I knew. But what ended up happening was like the first night. So now I'd been in 12 step for a while. We found out there was a youth that was drinking, right? And so Jen Devine, Jason, and we sat down and I said, there's some kid that's drinking down the hallway. I don't know how we found out, but we knew. And so I said, how do you deal with that? Because this was my first General Assembly. And she said, well, it's up to the youth leaders how they wanna if they want to deal with it or not. And so Jason wanted to deal with it. And so the two of us went to his room, said we knew he was drinking, that he needed to not do that, blah, blah, blah. We have this big long conversation. And that so I don't know if we had said that he had to leave the community or he had to I can't really remember specifically what the boundary was, but what ended up happening was we ended up having him leave youth housing, right? Because he broke the rules, and he was really wealthy, so he just got himself another room outside of youth housing and was still in the community and was kind of like, ha ha ha, like to us, right? Like it was really kind of interesting. So it was the first time that we dealt with that. It's always complicated around drugs and alcohol. He was smoking pot and stuff. And so that was kind of the first time. And in those days, if you were caught drinking or smoking pot, you would lose your leadership position. That was kind of one of the rules back then. And so that particular year in Ohio, they started doing the affinity groups and the anti-racism work. And it was really, really stressful for the youth who were leaders at that time, because there was so much resistance with white privilege, and then everybody wanted to focus on sexual identity instead of racial identity. So it was intense. It was hard. You could see it on them, like when we would have our meetings and stuff, and there were very few of us, right? Like there were not big staff members at that time, but it was a lot to take care of.
We will return after this message. I've learned so much through making our documentary and now launching this podcast. I'm amazed by the dedication, time, and resources it takes to bring these powerful stories to life. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to help us keep sharing them with the world, please visit YRUU.org/donate. So again, it's YRUU.org/donate. Every contribution, big or small, truly makes a difference. Thank you for being part of this journey.
The Canadians were part of YRUU at that time, and they were splitting off. So that was another big thing. Like the Canadians were really upset. The youth were really upset that they couldn't have cons together because we had had some cons in Canada. And then, so we get to Quebec, right? And Quebec is another. So what I had offered, this is when Dennis Meacham and I started to connect. Dennis had done an addictions ministry at United First Parish in Brewster. And he told me that pretty much 80% of the congregation, people had issues around alcohol or their loved ones. So there were a lot of people that went to see him, because Jim Robinson was super open. He was somebody before welcoming congregation. He was he was like so ahead of the curve, right? Really a tremendous, intuitive, insightful. I always said that he was the most Jesus-like person that I ever met, if I would imagine what Jesus would be like, right? Like really special. So they started this addictions ministry there, and Dennis wrote a book, Addictions and Faith Ministry. And Addictions Ministry and Faith Communities was the name of the book. So I said, Dennis, and now I was in Chatham at the time. I was the director there. It was a really small congregation, but I was doing a lot of trainings. I did probably 25 trainings, the USA and Canada, over a couple of years, maybe 5, 6 year period. And so Dennis, I said, Dennis, I'd like to have like a 12-step program for like a generic one like we did in Star Island, because we had a generic 12-step program on Star Island when everybody would go to their cocktail party. All of us that were in 12-step or any kind of addictions or Al-Anon or whatever, we would meet, and built our own community, just like people building their community around their substances, we built our community around our sobriety kind of a thing. So yeah, so then what happened? So our addiction, so Dennis and I can remember us being in this hotel room, and we had this invitation. It was written if anybody wanted to go to a 12-step meeting. So I said, Dennis, even if one person comes, then it's important, And it ended up a few people came. And people later that had real problems with addictions later on in their lives, you know what I mean? So it was kind of interesting to see who showed up and what kind of happened in the future. So there was a lot of stuff. I wasn't on staff then, but there was a lot of stuff going on. Again, really small staff, not able to manage the numbers and stuff. So then now we go to Boston. And I'm on staff for Boston. I'm the logistics coordinator. Maybe I might have been the chaplain, the youth chaplain in Quebec too. I think I was. I think that's how I was able to have these 12-step meetings and stuff. So, so then Boston happens. There were 800 youth that came. There were 800 youth, and we did not have a lot of staff. And what ended up happening, it was really unsafe. And there were issues that came up. I wasn't in the chaplaincy group, but there were some issues that came up. Same thing. I remember I used to go for a walk and do Tai Chi in the park, like in Boston. And then, because to take care of myself in the morning, I had to do that to ground myself. And then I remember going into the bathroom, and there was this girl that was throwing up, and it was like at like 7 in the morning. It was like really early in the morning. So that led us to this whole situation that was volatile. And again, it was around alcohol and whatever. And so after that, because there were so many situations that were difficult, so there were 800 youth. That was 1/3 of the entire GA community, which was a lot. And we did not have the resources to manage that. And so I remember right after that, we had this big meeting, and it was in Boston. And I remember being there with Hasmin, and just a lot of us were there, and just like, there needs to be more staff. We can't manage this and have it be safe. And so then they started to put more money into giving us more staff and stuff. So then and again there I did 12-step programs there too, like at that GA. So that was the second one. Except I had a youth leader, she and I led it together. So and maybe one person, a couple people would kind of trickle in. So then we get to Long Beach. So we're in Long Beach, and it ends up that the youth leaders were using, drinking, smoking, whatever. And so Jesse and Betty Jean, they said, Nan, what we want to do is, as a punishment, like in order for them to stay, they have to go to your 12-step meeting. There were like maybe 2 or 3 of them or whatever. We have the meeting, 20 people show up. It was like, I can remember every single person that's in that room. And to this day, I've never said who they were. But I was like, oh my God, like this is, and then Jesse said, well, how many, did people show up? And I said, Jesse, there were 20 people there. It's time that we start to do something about this. And so that was the point where I really reached out to try and get funding so that we could have a conference, a summit, where we could have youth from all over the USA, and we were still connected to Canada at that time. So Sylvia Bass West she was like the head of the RE, department in Canada and stuff. And so Sylvia, I contacted her and just said, I went to the youth office and asked them for funding. They said they would give us funding. And then when it came time, they were kind of nickel and diming. So I had the conference at my house, right? So I had people that were using, people that were sober, people that were in 12-step, people that had never drank before or smoked. So we had a really good people that used occasionally. So we had an incredible demographic and it was very diverse, diverse on both, racially and sexual preferences and all that stuff. So so what happened after Long Beach, Laura Manning came up to me and said, Nan, this is great that you're doing this, but this really needs to be youth led. And I went, you're right. But nobody was stepping up, right? And then Laura stepped up. So Laura and I organized this conference that was going to be at my house. We flew everybody in. We had enough money to fly everybody in. We had enough money to pay for food. So I did all that. Pat Holderhofer, she was at the UUA, really incredible minister. You would see some of her writings and stuff. She was an amazing person. She shows up, to talk about the boundaries and the sort of, the things that they were nervous about as far as all these youth being together at my house, kind of a thing for this conference, like the rules and stuff. Dennis showed up. Dennis came too, as he lived on the Cape. And it was freaking amazing. So Jason was there. There were a lot of people. I think probably about a dozen, maybe. So they slept on the floor. You remember my house was great for having a lot of people over and such. So what happened was what are we going to call this? And so as a group, we came up a commitment to community. This is what our commitment to community is. And then I was really kind of moving towards, well, if this is going to be institutionalized, we got to have some kind of an institutional structure. So why don't we have like small group ministries, right? And what we decided was that people would get into groups by their identities. And Ian Moore, he was from the Carolinas, he said, why don't we call them inside out groups? Because it was how you would like come from inside and how the things that were going inside you and how you would go out into the world, right? And so that's kind of how all that. And then we ended up with actually a worship service that Jason led in Chatham, because I was working in Chatham at the time. And that's how that started. So then we had a position. I'm going to see which after Long Beach was Fort Worth. It was next. So we were all set up to have inside out groups. We had workshops. We had a workshop. There were over 100 people showed up, youth and advisors. Everything was so well attended. Everything that we did was just so well attended. Yeah, and we had like one spot a day or something. And then yeah, it was great. So then the Fort Worth, there were a lot of things that happened, stuff that happened in Texas and with the youth of color, LDC. So then in Fort Worth, so we did all that. We had the conferences. We were part of the staff, the youth caucus staff. And then so we go to, and I think we were in Iowa. Remember, it was way out in the middle of nowhere. Like you couldn't even have cell phones there. And this was right after there was a bunch of stuff that happened. Something happened at youth worship where people were doing tom tom. It was like this whole racial, like this really awful, awful time, from what happened in Texas to to what happened at GA, and then here we are at youth council. So what we do is we set it up so the adults are in inside out groups together, right? And then we were super clear, like the one thing with every single conversation, it would start with, if you're hurting somebody, you're being hurt, or somebody's hurting you, we're going to report it. So we want you to know. So there was a lot of trust, that this is what it was. So if you share something, it means that you want some help, basically. The groups were so successful. Like the youth of color were in a group, there were queer men, queer women, people that didn't use, and they all got into these separate groups and had these conversations. And I had like a thing, like in 12-step programs, you have like these things, these steps that you read, but we adjusted them to the 7 principles, like using the principles and stuff. So I had rewritten some of those so that at the beginning we could share about those. We could do the big three. It was amazing. And then all the adults, they all had their addiction backgrounds too. You got a lot of people who grew up in the 60s, probably did a lot of tripping and shit. You know what I mean? So it was really, really good. It was really, really good. So then after that, we were in St. Louis, we were in Portland. We still were part of staff. And then and YRUU was starting to fall apart in 208, right? So the last youth caucus staff was like 207, or youth council, or the steering committee. So that kind of ended. And then also in between that, after Katrina, we had a social justice conference. There were 2 social justice conferences that I attended to, and one was in Chicago, and then one was in New Orleans. And I can say for myself, I did not have a good analysis. Like I was one of those people, well, we're all the same, like when I first started out. And what I learned was so much. Like my awareness about everything changed. It was like the best experience because I'm an experiential learner. It was the best education that I could have ever gotten. And then I saw once I got into hospice work and I was in communities where we were in poor parts of Dorchester, two really affluent areas, and you could see the disparity between the care for children that, didn't have the resources and sort of empowering, mothers from Haitian moms how to stand up for themselves. And you know what I mean? It was like a whole different, it was like taking all that raw and I had a lot of times I did not feel so good about myself because I didn't have an analysis. But I had so many young people around me willing to sort of teach me. Like, they gave me more space than I really deserved as far as my analysis went, because I had such good long-term relationships with, a lot of these people were together for, 4 years in really intense, situations. So that was a lot.
That that is a lot. It's like these two pathways of intensity that was going on,
Mm.
along with a really important role of supporting youth in general, right? There's this uh and so all these intense trainings and uh communities coming together, talking about really hard things were happening at the same time. Do you see this as a lead up to the end of YRUU? Was that affecting the lead up to YRUU? Is it a totally separate thing? What do you think?
I think it was really hard for a lot of the ministers of color and adults of color to see how painful it was for the young youth of color, like the people that were all in drum and stuff. And I wasn't a part of that. And just shutting it down, and also the resistance of the white privileged culture, people were not interested or ready, and the teenagers were ready. They were ready. We want to, and they were so far ahead of the curve. Think about the world now. It's just unbelievable. Like that was a pivotal moment. They could have put in more resources. So they had an opportunity, 800 youth at GA, that if they put in more resources and listened, because the whole common ground, all those people that were working towards anti-racism education, a lot of the adults did not agree with because it was painful, and we all come in with our own pains too, and it was difficult. It was difficult to see this small group of young people in an environment where this is supposed to be their community, and there's so much prejudice, racial prejudice because of their own analysis. So it was really tough. And then alcohol and drugs, all that stuff kind of played a part in it. So at least I feel like with doing commitment to community, it was an opportunity for people to talk, for people to, to talk about what it's like being queer in the community and what it's like being a youth of color and yet finding the ways to bond, to bond to each other, at least in this big organization that's supposed to be their faith community. So, and I guess, to look at it, it's where everybody was at. You know, it's where the organization was at, was one of the things Bill Singford had said, right? That he regretted, like, and yet he was, the first black president. Kind of reminded me, it was sort of like the presidential, then Obama was elected after that, and how difficult it is with a bunch of white people, with their own privileges and not wanting to move or not thinking it's important for them to move or to tokenize or to whatever, wherever they are on their own personal spiritual journey. It was difficult. It was difficult for him, I would imagine. And yet I remember some youth they were youth on board. They would go to all the board meetings and everybody would be drinking. They had a liquor cabinet where everybody drank, right? And then you've got a couple of youth on board. It was exclusive too, you know what I mean? So there was a lot. So what ended up happening, Dennis and I, around 2008, I held a conference. I was on addictions ministry group, right? So we met at Pickett and Elliott. So I was with this group and it was an interfaith group, right? But we had met there and Dennis was a big part of that. That's where I got to know him better. So I held a conference at this conference center where, again, we brought in all these people from all over the US, even ministers with sex addicts that were sex addicts, all kinds of addictions, and then went through all the history of what we did with the youth community and really wanted to have some sort of a policy for the whole organization, right? Because when I was doing my chaplaincy training and I was at United First Parish in Quincy, and I got a group. There was a group in Bedford. They were having a lot of trouble with addictions there with their teens, and they would have fundraisers where they were selling alcohol to raise funds for all the youth activities. Yeah, it was like this really, again, but these are the cultures, you're trying to change culture of it was like, there's no reason why people should drink at an event. Like, and one thing about Quincy that I loved, it was a sober congregation. They never had alcohol at any events. I think that's why I stayed there as long as I did. It was not a part of the culture. Terry Switzer was a district executive. When I first started working in Barnstable, I started doing youth work, and he came down to the basement on a Sunday and he said to me, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done with the youth community. I was like shocked. I'm like, oh, the district executive came down to thank me, kind of a thing. Fast forward, we're in this addictions ministry thing. Terry Switzer is now somebody that's high in the UUA. So I had this connection to him, like, right? And Dennis knew him. So Dennis and I were coming up with a policy for the Unitarian Universalist Association around this. I had a couple phone calls with him. He said, you got to look at your brand. He gave me all this advice. Dennis and I worked on stuff. We make an appointment with him the day before he cancels. And Dennis was like, I'm done with the association. He goes, I'm done. They do not want to move their culture, which was very similar to all the anti-racism stuff they did not want to move the culture. So we were kind of bumping up against a culture, you know, a history where people were not ready to shift their consciousness or change or whatever. So that was interesting. So Dennis, he goes, I'm all done. And so I was too. I said, I'm not gonna, there's nothing else I can do. So that's the whole story. This is a lot, right?
Yeah, heavy. So when you say you're done with the larger picture, working at it with the UUA in general. What does done mean for you?
So I was done trying to participate in shifting the culture there. It was too rooted in its own tradition, right? So I really moved away from the whole Unitarian stuff. And, you know, Elizabeth, she was on the last steering committee that was there in 2008. She was done. And I was doing chaplaincy training. And you know, it's interesting. I can remember talking to Danny West and Megan Dowdell. I can remember we were in a pub at a General Assembly, and I said, I'd really love to be a minister. And they said to me, well, you can be a chaplain. And I was like, well, how would I do that? No, I couldn't do that. And it ended up being the track that I took, which really taught me more about pastoral care, really gave me more pastoral care experience at Brigham and Women's. I was there for 5 years and then went right into hospice after that. So as far as my own sort of expansion, you know, it was like I can just remember that that's the message that they gave me. And even somebody to even connect with who I contacted at Brigham and Women's and ended up applying to be a chaplain there. And yeah, so it was really something. But there were so many wonderful things. Like I remember Jen Devine. I went out with her. I used to meet her in Boston once a year. I loved her. And one of the things I said, you know, that I had learning disabilities, and she goes, well, Nan, you're somebody that we really need because there's a lot of youth that have the same. So you're really, you know, she really made me feel significant, like that I had something to offer. So the relationships I had with the people there, I continue to have today, you know, and at least in memory too. Like I hold it, you know, so close. And while I was going through that whole process and to go and get into a chaplaincy program at a school that was Harvard connected and have no education, no formal education, I couldn't even today, I wouldn't have been able to be a director. Or if I was a person of color back in those days with no education, I would not have. And to see where my life has taken me has been all around having a spiritual life and a life of service, which really YRUU was like my training ground for really being of service and learning about my own control issues and learning about myself and expanding my consciousness and my awareness. And then I ended up, when George Floyd died, I was in Scotland. And I have a friend who had an organization called Calmer Choice. And it was how they taught mindfulness in elementary schools. And in there, they had this big issue around the religious right. Because they were teaching meditation, the religious right was saying you're teaching them Buddhism. So they had to work with their language. And that I learned then that the religious right had so many attorneys, like they almost lost their business, but they ended up having the right help or got the help. And so when George Floyd died, I ended up doing I developed this thing called AWARE, Awakening with Anti-Racism Education, around how, as white people, how we have to understand our own prejudices from our family, and also, just learn about cultural diversity and cultural prejudice and racial prejudice. And so what I did for them is I did a workshop, like a weekend, a 2-day workshop, and then I educated their board. And then what I did is I gave them anti-racism moments for their meetings. So that, and I did a lot of research. I had like films, I had like articles for everybody's learning style. So whatever they wanted to, that was their homework. So once a month, I would create this aware moment, is what I called it. I would have done any of that if I hadn't learned all the things that I learned from YRUU. I would not be the person that I am if it wasn't for that. So I'm so grateful, like so grateful um to all the people that have nurtured me and allowed me to experience what I experienced in YRUU. I did a lot because of that experience. I've had a really full, beautiful life because of it, and a spiritual life outside of, just my own spiritual development, the freedom to explore. That's what that gave me, the freedom to explore my own spiritual journey, because there were so many different places I could learn from, and then becoming a spiritual director was like the best, something I can continue doing now. So yeah, that's that, Lindsay. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
This podcast was produced by Linden Tree Productions. The interview was conducted by Lindsay Cattle-LaPointe.
Music featured by Scott Murphy and Matt Meyer.
For more information, go to yruu.org. That's the question all spelled out, yruu.org.
Don't forget our documentary, YRUU, is available to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo.
Please subscribe and review this podcast. It will really help more folks find this content.